Emil, if you'd like to share your screen.
Hopefully everyone can see that okay. So thank you for your time today. I had originally written a different presentation for this, but there was something Graham said, and I actually decided to change my mind at the start, because it's been quite interesting that, all the talk of intervention, regarding more so should be prevention. And that's one of the big things that we do with Toxteth El8te. So we were established in 2022, and we've grown considerably since then. We focus on working with young people ages between 6 and 25. The numbers you see in here are actually really out of date. It's incredibly more than that, and we're quite privileged to work with really, really high numbers. A lot of that is down to kind of primarily two things. Everything we do is free. Everything we have always done is free, which leads to obviously, high level access, and we remove those barriers to basketball. But it's a lot more than just about basketball, and I think there's this misnomer about sport being this wonderful catalyst for change. I think it only becomes a wonderful catalyst for change when you actually do something with it rather than just the act itself. And that's something that we focus on greatly. We are based in Toxteth, based in Liverpool 8, and that was a conscious choice from ourselves. I grew up there post-riot in the 80s, and witnessed both the devastation of Liverpool and Toxteth in the 1980s, and when the time was right, came back to create this program with several others. We have grown to such an extent that capacity doesn't even come into it now, and we're split over a few different areas. With we have our core areas supported primarily by the VRP and Merseyside Police, and the three main areas are Toxteth El8te Basketball, which is our community kind of wing, which is mixed with an elite wing as well. There's LVP 3-on-3, which is held in Liverpool 1 once a year, which attracts thousands and thousands of people over them 3 or 4 days. And then we have Midnight League, and Midnight League is something that at the start of Toxteth El8te we were incredibly passionate about creating, because it is one of the only late night provisions existing in Liverpool on a weekly basis in the city centre, and it targets a particular age group. And out of that, we were quite lucky to be able to do some primary research. So we commissioned some master's level research measuring the impact of mental health on the participants and coaches of Midnight League and what that does. And the outcomes of that was really, really interesting, and it gave us a lot of foundation to kind of expand even more. What you see in front of you now is our Toxteth El8te Unite program, and this is our community-based program, and this is where our volume comes from between this and Midnight League as well. So every Friday, which is our open sessions, we start at 6 p.m. and we end up finishing at 11 p.m. across 2 different venues, and we literally have hundreds coming through every week just on that night alone, and that age ranges from 6 to 25. Alongside that, we have our elite kind of pathway now as well, because one of the things we were very aware of was it was wonderful to create this community and this provision, but where were the pathways? Where was the way for children to gain them skills and put them to good use? So we created an elite pathway to run parallel, of which now has become incredibly successful, to the extent that one of our teams has currently got one of the best records in the UK, 2 years unbeaten, winning everything basically, which is kind of unheard of. But it gives validation to the program that we have. We do take a different approach though, and that was one of the kind of reasons why I kind of threw away my presentation before, because this the concept of intervention for us was something we wrote about quite a lot at the start, but quite quickly realized that we wanted to be preventative rather than just intervention based. And I was privileged to go and do a piece of research in the US in September. And I managed to visit and work with organizations across the US, ironically, in places now which have become synonymous with troubles. So I was in Minneapolis and Minnesota, Chicago, LA, New York, and Atlanta. I got to see firsthand how they are working within communities, how they are trying to create change. One of the most interesting things to come out of that, which I think is applicable for everyone, is why I want to talk about it. There's a sociologist in Minnesota who specializes in race and sport. And my research was actually about one part was how do you measure impact on provision like ours? How do you measure impact of intervention in itself? And I think that is always a fundamental problem in what we all do, is we all go out and we create these programs, we implement them, we work within communities. But then when it comes to measuring them, a lot of the time we're measuring them from an evaluation perspective tied to grant funding, whereas the actual measuring of impact isn't measured at the end of a grant. It can be measured in years. It can be measured in anecdotal aspects, the change in an individual's life, the change in numerous people's lives, even from a public health argument. And one of the things was in the 90s in the US, the government poured millions of dollars into Midnight League basketball programs across the US. And I sat with the guy who created it, and he's really famous in the US, Bill Clinton, used to visit him and, all these things. And ultimately it failed. And it failed because it was very difficult to measure the impact. And that was one of the things that the sociologist and I spoke about. The other thing as well, and I'm just kind of challenging for everyone else here as well, the concept of intervention can actually be quite negative. There's a presumption that when you create something for intervention, that there's something wrong. When reality is that it's not a stick and plaster. We take a stick and plaster approach so much rather than actually take a preventative approach. And programs like ours, especially with the volume that we have, we work on that principle. And we work on that principle of not only what happens on the court, but it's the reality of what happens off the court, the sense of identity, accountability, the removal of barriers, the ability, to work with psychologists, nutritionists, taking that holistic approach overall. And we reap the benefits of that with what we're seeing and our wider reach and our wider impact. So when you take something like LVP, we have the ability to essentially have something which could be classed as an intervention project at the heart of Liverpool 1, where the rates of antisocial behaviour order are extremely high. So last year's event took place, I think it was 2 weeks after the kids had been running around with machetes and the hundreds of kids had been hailing around, and there was the section 60 on it in the Echo and everything else like that. And we were there 2 weeks later and there wasn't a single incident in the park at that point. And it was a wonderful feeling that to be able to create an event that can have an immediate impact in an area of high concentration of antisocial behaviour issues. And it shows at that point, would we be classed as an intervention or a prevention? And the argument is it is a prevention at that point rather than an intervention. And we actively work to take that approach. And that's why we've also focused a lot on research over the past few years. And that's why we work with the likes of the UN now and their preventative work with sport and violence and other aspects as well. So I kind of get frustrated when, there's this real focus on intervention and we all chase those funding streams because that's all that's out there. And I think that was one of the things that Graham was talking about, intervention, and it was just kind of springing to mind of that negative connotation is that there is something wrong, and that in itself can act as a barrier for access to. And that we found quite interestingly, and it was something which kind of blew my mind, was that we're based in Toxteth, and the change in the city in terms of the diaspora of immigration was really interesting for us. So we were finding that in areas where there were newer populations of African immigration, i.e. in the north end of the city, due to the socio-economic housing policy of the city, the kids' parents were unwilling to send them to Toxteth because of the reputation that Toxteth had, which for us was like completely mind-blowing and ironic. And we had to do a lot of work to break even those barriers down within our city. And there was a perception because, one, we were free, was there a catch, but also two, because we were maybe classed as an intervention project. And that was a really interesting concept for us in terms of how we frame and reframe them things. But Midnight League for us is extremely important. One, because of the late night timing of it and what that can actually do in terms of creating that safe space, creating a space where there is an alternative for people. And one of the quotes which came out of the research that we did into Midnight League was said, on a Friday night, most people my age would be going to a club or be doing something that maybe they shouldn't do, or they would be drinking, etc. But now I've got somewhere to go, which is good. And that core time, that time which essentially is an intervention time, we give them an outlet, a place, a space, which is unusual. And I saw a program in the Bronx and New York City do this amazing, huge program, very joined up program across the, the citywide and other organizations. And it's called a Beacon program. And anytime in the summer months, the schools open from 6 a.m. to midnight, and they're accessible for young people throughout that time. And what was even more interesting in that circumstance was how they dealt with the police. And I arrived in the Bronx, and the area I was in had the highest levels of crime in the whole of New York. And there was police outside, police when I entered, and I was talking with the coaches and representative of the city's program, and the police came and sat with us. And I asked them, how do you deal with the physical presence of the police? And they said, oh, we're here every night and every day. And I said, are you always in uniform? And they were like, yeah. And I said, okay, how does that work from a community perspective? And what they said it was the norm. So I asked them what the outcomes of that norm was, and they said they had the ability to engage on different levels because of the environment, and because of the nature of the environment was so open from early morning to late at night, that enabled them to work within their community rather than policing it. And it was a fundamentally different kind of approach to intervention as such, and it was a very much a preventative measure. But what they did say to me was, when there were times they had to have a form of intervention, it allowed them to do it in such a different and better way because of how they had been educated, because they were so active within the community as well. So even though I know I'm meant to talk about our wonderful program and I could tell you all these wonderful things, I just thought it might be a little bit more challenging talking about the concept of intervention and prevention, considering what everyone here has to do and what maybe we're tasked to do. But I'll hand it back over to you, and if anyone's got any questions, I'm happy to answer them at another time or whenever.
Thanks, Emil. That's really insightful. I was thinking all the way as you were talking about, the good practice of placing the young people or the person at the heart of everything we do, and language is so important as a part of that process, isn't it? And I think it can be for all of us when we're in the vernacular of our working day, or we're in the vernacular of those discussions with colleagues and professionals, we can describe things in a certain way and it just becomes the norm. And I think it's really helpful to be challenged on that. I think it's a good practice for us all to think about, are we using the right terms, phrases, in particular when we're working or building opportunities for people who are not us in a sense. We have to really carefully consider that. So thank you very much.